I've been a freelance land surveyor for about 15 years. Most of my work is solo, remote stuff. I'm usually camping out for days at a time in places nobody else is going to. I actually prefer it that way. Or at least I used to. This happened about 4 years ago. I'd been hired to survey boundary markers on a parcel up in the mountains near the Clearwater region in Idaho. Remote doesn't even begin to describe it. It was a 6-mile hike just to reach where I set up camp. I filed my route with the local ranger station, like I always do, and I packed a week's worth of supplies. The first day went smoothly. I found 3 markers, logged everything, and made it back to camp before dark. The forecast had called for cold and light snow, and that's pretty much what I got. By the second day, though, things started to change. We got way more snow than expected. The next marker was only about a mile out of the way, so instead of calling it right then and there, I figured, what the hell? That was a mistake. I honestly still think about how stupid it was not to just hunker down or get out of the woods when I had the chance. The terrain was all hidden rocks and icy slopes under fresh snow. In other words, the worst possible conditions to hike through. I was picking my way down a short embankment when my boot hit a patch of ice. I never saw one wrong step like that and you could die. And I mean that literally. I slid probably 15 feet before catching myself on a tree root. I was lucky not to have slid further, but the pain in my right ankle was instant. I tried to tell myself I was fine, but the moment I stood up, I audibly groaned in pain. I couldn't put much weight on that leg, and I knew it would be a few hours before I'd be able to walk normally. I was so mad at myself, but there was nothing I could do. I abandoned the rest of the work right there. No markers were worth getting stranded over. I painfully made my way back uphill to the main trail and started the slow hike back toward camp. But after a few minutes, I noticed boot tracks on the trail. They seemed to have come from further into the woods on my left. They were heading in the same direction I was going, and they looked somewhat fresh, which I could tell by how sharp the edges were despite the fact that it was snowing. I figured it was probably a hunter, or maybe someone from the landowner's crew checking on the property. It's not unusual to cross paths with people out there, even in remote areas. I didn't think much of it. I just kept moving, trying to keep as much weight off my ankle as possible. As the light started fading, I began hearing sounds behind me. At first, I chalked it up to normal forest noises, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps. I kept turning around and looking over my shoulder, but I couldn't see anything. That part of the forest was pretty dense, so if there were any animals or something stalking me, there was a good chance I wouldn't have been able to see it anyway. I stopped walking, and the sound stopped too. Not right away. There was a delay of maybe 1 or 2 seconds, but then it stopped. I froze and listened for anything out of the ordinary, but there was nothing beyond the wind and snow. I started walking again, and this time the footsteps didn't resume, so I thought everything was fine. But then, a few minutes later, I heard those damn footsteps again. I kept turning around, but I couldn't see anything. It was especially terrifying, because I knew I wouldn't be able to run if there was a threat out there. That was the worst part. I would have loved to investigate or try to scare off whatever was stalking me, but I didn't have the mobility to do so, so I just kept moving. Then I heard something metallic off to my left. I don't really know how to describe it. It was this low sound, like something lightly hitting a fence post or a piece of equipment. It was disturbing because there wasn't supposed to be anything but trees out there, so I had no idea what could be making a metallic sound of all things. The sound must have distracted me, because it suddenly dawned on me that I hadn't been keeping track of those footprints I noticed earlier. I looked down and realized they were gone. I turned around frantically, but I couldn't see where they had branched off, or if they had turned around. I kept looking to my left, trying to see through the trees so I could at least spot whatever had made the sound. Then my eyes locked onto something, and alarm bells started going off in my head. There was another set of footprints coming out of the tree line on my left, running parallel to mine through the snow. They weren't that far away, which was the most concerning part. Whoever had been ahead of me on that trail was now walking alongside me through the trees. At that point, I was so scared that I wasn't thinking straight. I should have kept my mouth shut. I should have just kept going. But instead, I spoke up and asked if anyone was there. I didn't get an answer. After about 20 seconds of waiting, I knew I had to get out of there. But my ankle was still killing me, so I couldn't move fast. I wanted to run or at least jog, but I couldn't. I was pretty close to camp though, so I just told myself that if I kept moving, I'd be fine. I wasn't hearing footsteps behind me anymore, which was good, but I knew there was someone out there. Someone who had been ahead of me at one point. I was really close to my sight when I heard the sound of a heavy branch snapping from somewhere behind me. It obviously wasn't a natural sound, or I wouldn't mention it. I didn't stop moving. I kept thinking that if I just made it back, I'd be okay. And eventually, I did reach my campsite. It was fully dark at that point, and only after getting inside my tent did I realize I wasn't any safer in there than I had been hobbling through the woods. I started packing immediately. My injured foot made it so hard to move quickly, but I did my best to rush. I'd say maybe 60% of how scared I was came from knowing that in a fight or a chase, I would be completely helpless. Before I finished packing, I heard the thing I had been dreading the entire time. Footsteps right outside the tent. I was absolutely terrified. The footsteps weren't approaching my tent. They were circling it. There was nothing I could do but wait for them to charge. The circling went on for what felt like 5 minutes before everything suddenly went quiet. I hadn't heard whoever it was walk away, but I didn't care. I was leaving, person or not. I finished packing, took a deep breath, unzipped the tent, and stepped out into the snow. The moment I got outside, I looked into the trees and screamed. There was a man standing in the tree line, staring at me. He looked old and sickly, almost like he was dying. He looked wrong. I stared back at him, fully expecting him to charge me, but he didn't. I put my hands up and said, "I don't want any trouble." He didn't respond. We just stood there, staring at each other for what felt like minutes. Then he said something I still think about to this day. "You're a lucky man." And then he turned and disappeared into the woods. The rest of that night is a blur, partly because of the pain and partly because of what had just happened. If that man had wanted to hurt me, he easily could have. I wouldn't have been able to stop him. I finished packing and left, not even caring that it was dark. Later, I was told I had severely sprained my ankle, and it was a miracle I hadn't made it worse by walking on it. I reported what happened, but I knew nothing would come of it. I didn't take another winter contract for almost a year. I still do remote work. It's my livelihood. But I don't camp alone during winter assignments anymore. I either bring someone with me, or I turn the job down. This is still the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. I've lived in Alaska most of my life. My family moved to Fairbanks when I was 6, and I never really left. I spent my summers working fish camps as a teenager, started guiding professionally in my early 20s. And that's basically been my life ever since. I'm 29 now. I work seasonally as a wilderness guide in northern Alaska, and I've been doing it long enough that I don't really get rattled out there. I don't get lost. Or I guess I should say, I didn't think I could get lost, because what happened 3 years ago forced me to reconsider that. My boyfriend at the time was Randy. He grew up in rural British Columbia and was basically the male version of me when it came to the outdoors. Actually, that's not really fair to him. He was probably more experienced than me in certain areas, especially winter navigation. We had been together about 4 years, and most of our relationship revolved around trips that would make normal couples absolutely miserable. Week-long hunts and backcountry camping where you actually have to plan or you'll die. That sounds dramatic, but it's literally true up there. The plan was to snowmobile between two state-registered cabins about 60 miles apart. We'd spend a night at each and be back home in 4 days. We had done the exact trip twice before, and it had always been fine. The weather forecast looked good when we left, so we weren't worried at all. The first day was completely uneventful. We got to the second cabin by late afternoon, ate these freeze-dried meals that Randy swore tasted good, but were honestly terrible. And then we played cards. It was a pretty relaxing evening. The next morning, I woke up and realized there was a serious storm going on outside. It was basically a full-on blizzard that came out of nowhere, which was surprising because there had been nothing in the forecast indicating precipitation. Randy and I decided to brave the storm, even though we had plenty of food and could have waited another day. We should have waited. I know that now. Things went south really quickly. The wind was almost worse than the snow. It was incredibly hard to see anything. So Randy took the lead. I followed the track of his snowmobile, which made navigating a lot easier in low visibility. I don't know exactly how it happened, but 1 second Randy was moving along normally, and the next, his snowmobile was on top of him. I jumped off mine and ran over to him, but it was too late. His leg was bent in a way legs should never bend. Keep in mind, this was a guy who once finished a 2-day trek on a sprained ankle and didn't even mention it until we got back. So seeing him like that, I knew it was bad. The first thing I tried was getting him onto my snowmobile. That was the obvious move. Just ride both of us back to the cabin. But Randy was 6'2" and around 220 pounds, and a snowmobile in deep snow is already difficult to handle alone. I managed to get him onto the back once, kind of dragging him onto the seat, but he lasted maybe 10 seconds before sliding off. The sound he made when he hit the ground, I never want to hear that again. I tried one more time, and it was even worse. He couldn't grip with his legs at all, and every small shift caused him to slide. There was no way I could hold him and steer at the same time. After that second attempt, he told me to stop, and the way he said it, he wasn't asking, he was telling me. That's when we both understood what had to happen. I pulled out the satellite phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I managed to get a connection after a few tries, but I wasn't even sure if my message, our coordinates and situation, actually went through. Relying on someone else to rescue him was a terrible plan, and we both knew it. So I made the decision I would leave him sheltered with everything we had, then take my snowmobile and push for the nearest cabin to use the emergency radio. There wasn't much discussion. We just looked at each other, and that was it. I bundled him up with every extra layer we had and marked our position on my GPS. He told me to be careful, then told me not to do anything stupid. and then I left him there in the snow. I navigated mostly by instinct and GPS, but I was struggling to stay calm. After about 45 minutes, something felt wrong. The terrain didn't match what I expected. Landmarks weren't lining up. I told myself it was just the storm, messing with my perception. But the feeling kept getting worse. Then I saw smoke through the trees on my left. I turned toward it, thinking I had somehow looped back to one of the cabins. But the structure didn't match either one. It was smaller and honestly kind of unsettling. One side of it was almost buried in a snowdrift. There was a faint glow from inside, and smoke was coming from the chimney. At that point, all I could think was, smoke means a person, and a person means help. I shut off the engine and walked to the door. I knocked several times. No answer. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside, it was warm, clearly lived in. There was a wood stove burning, a bedroll on the floor, and a can of food with a spoon still in it, as if someone had just stepped out moments ago. I called out, but no one responded. I stood there warming my hands, trying the satellite phone again, but still nothing. I didn't want to go back out into that storm, but I had to. Randy was depending on me. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On a shelf at the back of the cabin were binoculars, a folded map, and a notebook. I opened the map. It was a trail map of the area we had been riding through. Sections were circled, including both cabins we had stayed in. Next to them were dates, some from that winter, some from previous years. Then I opened the notebook. Whoever owned it had been documenting people, descriptions of individuals, what they wore, where they were headed. I felt a chill run through me. There was a good chance Randy and I were in that notebook, and I wasn't sticking around to find out. It's hard to explain what I felt in that moment. It wasn't immediate fear. It was like everything in that cabin suddenly rearranged itself in my mind. It didn't feel safe anymore. I put everything down and headed straight for the door. But before I could grab the handle, I heard a scream. The loudest, most horrifying scream I have ever heard. It came from beneath the floor. A woman. She wasn't saying anything, just screaming like she was being tortured. The sound hit me so hard I literally jumped. And then I ran. I sprinted out of that cabin, started my snowmobile, and rode away without looking back. I never saw that cabin again. The rest of the journey is a blur. At some point, I reached the actual cabin and managed to contact help through the emergency radio. They sent a helicopter. Randy was hypothermic and barely hanging on, but he survived. His leg was in terrible condition, but he was alive. I told authorities everything. Days later, they claimed they couldn't find any cabin matching my description. One of them even suggested I hallucinated the whole thing. I lost it on him. There are only 3 possible explanations, and none of them are good. I hallucinated everything. It was real, and I left someone behind to die. It was a trap, and I narrowly escaped becoming the next victim. I still think about it all the time.
When I was a junior in high school, there was this girl I spent a lot of time thinking about. Her name was Sienna Rollins. She had this alluring presence about her that's kind of hard to explain. But I'll try my best. She was really pretty, of course. But it was more than that. She had this mystique that I could never quite understand. A kind of presence you wouldn't normally associate with a typical pretty girl. She wasn't popular, and I got the impression that most people, guys and girls, were more intimidated by her than anything else. She wasn't warm. She didn't smile. Most people thought she was weird. I didn't. I found her fascinating. Whenever our eyes met, I would freeze up. Like how your body reacts when you step into a cold room or feel a sudden gust of wind. She reminded me of snow, the way a light snowfall muffles everything around you, even your own thoughts. She had that effect, but it felt like I was the only one who noticed it. Everyone else just saw someone quiet and distant, but I always wanted to know what she was thinking. At the time, I read a lot of young adult fantasy novels, so that probably influenced things. I also wrote a lot back then. I even named one of the characters in a story I was working on Sienna. You could say I was obsessed, but I also just liked the name. Anyway, one day I was walking up the stairs with my friend George, talking about that exact story. He asked me what the characters' names were, so I told him. And of course, the moment I said Sienna, who turns the corner, but the actual Sienna herself, walking with one of her friends. She smirked. It was the closest thing to a smile you could get from her. And she said something like, "Yeah, because you love me." I was completely embarrassed. George started laughing, which made it even worse. She was already walking past me, clearly not interested in continuing the conversation, and my chance was slipping away. I don't know what came over me, but right there, on the spot, I asked her out. That actually made her stop. She turned and gave me one of her signature cold stares. She didn't even need to speak. Her eyes said everything. How dare you even ask me that? But then she surprised me. She said yes. She gave me her number, then told me she'd text me, and walked away without letting me respond. I was shocked. But that's how I ended up going on a hike with the girl I had been thinking about for months. The hike wasn't my idea, by the way. None of it was. She planned everything, and I got the feeling I didn't really have a say in it. And honestly, I didn't mind. Fast forward to the weekend. Sienna picked me up and drove us to a trail she had chosen. I had never been there, and neither had anyone I knew. The drive was about 45 minutes, but it felt like 10 because I was so lost in my thoughts. She had the window down, playing music from her phone, stuff I didn't recognize. We pulled into a gravel lot at the base of the trail. There were maybe 2 other cars there. Sienna didn't hesitate. She just started walking. I followed. For the first 20 minutes, everything was actually great. She was more talkative than I had ever seen her, which still wasn't very talkative, but for her, it was a lot. She asked about the story I was writing, which was a bit embarrassing, but I gave her a rough summary anyway. Eventually, the trail narrowed and the trees got denser. We hadn't seen anyone since the parking lot. Then we reached a fork in the trail. I asked which way. She pointed left, without hesitation. I asked if she had been there before. She said no. That felt strange, especially with how confident she seemed, but I didn't question it. The left path was clearly less maintained. I started getting the feeling we were going the wrong way, but I kept quiet. At some point, I realized I couldn't hear her footsteps anymore. The trail had become so narrow that we were walking single file, and she had told me to go first. But when I turned around, she was gone. The trail behind me was empty. I called her name. No response. Confused, I walked back to the fork. She wasn't there either. I thought maybe she had stepped off to use the bathroom, but there was nowhere for her to go. No side trail, nothing. She had just disappeared. So I tried the right path. It was even more overgrown. The further I went, the less it felt like a real trail. I kept calling her name, not knowing what else to do. Then I heard a branch snap off to my left. I looked over and saw movement behind a tree. I immediately thought it was her, messing with me. That felt like something she would do. So I decided to turn the tables. I crept toward the tree as quietly as I could, and then jumped out to scare her. But mid-yell, I realized it wasn't Sienna. It was a man, tall, middle-aged, and completely calm. I froze.
Then instinct kicked in and I stepped back. I blurted out something about looking for my friend, but it sounded stupid even as I said it. He didn't care. He started walking toward me, so I turned and walked quickly back toward the trail, trying not to run. Then another sound, this time from my right. I looked and saw a second man. He wasn't hiding. He was just standing there watching me, holding what looked like a tree branch. That's when I ran. The second man was blocking the way back to the trail, so I ran deeper into the woods, not even knowing where I was going, just trying to escape. Both of them started chasing me. They weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. The forest was dense and it was hard to move fast. Then suddenly, something grabbed my ankle. I fell hard. It was the first man. He tried to pin me down. I screamed and kicked and somehow managed to break free. I got back up and ran. My mouth was full of blood. I must have bitten it when I fell. I didn't look back. I just kept running until I found the trail. Then I ran all the way back to the parking lot. Sienna's car was still there, but the other two cars were gone. Sienna wasn't anywhere in sight. I panicked. I thought those men had taken her. I called her phone over and over. No answer. I was just about to call the police when she texted me, "Where did you go?" As I was replying, I looked up and saw her walking out of the tree line, completely calm. I shouted at her to hurry and told her what happened. She didn't seem scared, not even a little. She looked annoyed. We got in the car and left. I told her everything. She barely reacted. That's when I asked her where she had gone. She said she thought I had gone ahead and that she was trying to catch up. That was impossible. I had walked all the way back to the fork. There was no way I would have missed her. That's when a thought hit me. What if she had something to do with it? I didn't know how or why, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The ride home was tense. I kept looking at her, wondering if someone who seemed so calm, so distant, could actually do something like that. Honestly, the answer is probably yes. She dropped me off. We said goodbye, and that was it. We never hung out again. I never reached out to her, and she never reached out to me. I've told this story to a few friends over the years. They all say the same thing, that she set me up, that she knew those men, that she led me there on purpose. I've thought about that more times than I can count, but I still don't understand why anyone would do something like that. I don't know where Sienna is now. She's not on social media, and I have no idea what happened to her after high school.
It's crazy to think that 2008 was almost 20 years ago, but here we are. For anybody who's too young to remember, the early 2000s were sort of like the Wild West for the internet in many ways. Back in 2008, I was in my early 20s, and honestly, I was a bit reckless. I was way too trusting, and I was the king of saying things like, "That could never happen to me." I just never really had that sense of urgency or anxiety that others had. That is, until one spring evening, when I experienced firsthand that downright evil individuals really do exist in the world. Facebook had just started to blow up, but most people I knew were still using MySpace. Social media was a thing, but not like today. We had all heard horror stories about the internet, but nobody I knew actually cared. Or more accurately, we were all just incredibly ignorant. I bring all this up because perhaps the most insane thing about the internet at the time was a little website called Craigslist. Now, I know Craigslist is still around, but it's nothing compared to what it was back in the early 2000s. We didn't have websites like Marketplace, so if you wanted something, you went to Craigslist. You could find and purchase anything, from small trinkets to vehicles, and everything in between. You could even find work or odd jobs for some extra cash. I had heard from friends who used Craigslist all the time that it was the greatest website ever. They swore by it. I never really had any interest in visiting the website until my life started to unravel a bit in the spring of 2008. I was living with my girlfriend, and with almost no notice, she dumped me and threw me out of the house. Thankfully, I wasn't living on the street or anything like that because I had friends who let me crash at their place. I spent the immediate days after the breakup trying to find my own apartment, but it was proving harder than I thought on my 7-an-hour salary. One of my friends whom I mentioned earlier, the one who swore by Craigslist, told me to check it out for possible houses or even rooms for rent. I may have been reckless and ignorant, but surprisingly that was a hard pass for me. I don't know why. I just didn't love the idea. However, I did start looking for furniture and items to eventually fill my place whenever I found one, since she kept everything after the breakup. At first, it was like a treasure chest of goods. I could finally see why people loved Craigslist. I literally could find anything I needed. I was finding deals left and right. My buddy had a massive garage that he allowed me to store my recently purchased furniture in until I found my own place. One afternoon, I was looking for a love seat or a small couch to store in the garage. I found a post from a guy named Keith who was selling a whole sectional for $45. He had a picture with the posting, and it was a smaller sectional sofa that could fit in most living rooms. Not to mention, it looked like it was in great shape. The price seemed too good to be true. But like I said, I was ignorant, and I just saw a cool couch and a low price tag. I messaged Keith, and to my surprise, he responded almost right away and told me the couch was still available. He seemed friendly and trustworthy. Well, as trustworthy as anyone can be over messaging on the internet. He told me that he had gotten a new job in another state and was just trying to sell quickly, hence the low price. The reason seemed good enough to me, so we exchanged numbers and set up a time to meet that evening. A meetup that would go on to traumatize me for years and open my eyes to the horror that exists even in our own backyards. I pulled up to the house around 9 p.m. that night. Probably a red flag for most, but not for me at the time. He told me he had some other work arrangement, so he couldn't meet until that time. It didn't seem weird to me. The house was dark, and not just because it was nighttime. Everything looked desolate. It was a very rundown street with almost no street lamps. There were several houses on the block, and they were all just as dark and decrepit as Keith's house. I tried calling Keith several times with the number he gave me, but I kept getting one of those automated responses saying the number was no longer in service. Just as I was about to drive away, my phone buzzed. It was a weird number with a different area code. I answered, and I was greeted with a friendly yet somewhat unnerving voice. His voice was deep and almost erratic. He called me fella and started apologizing about the phone situation. He told me he had broken his phone earlier and was calling me from his work phone. I was definitely a little weirded out, but not scared. Honestly, I was more annoyed than anything. I realize hindsight is 20/20, but at the time, when you're in these situations, your brain works differently. I wasn't thinking about danger. I was thinking about that couch. He told me to meet him around the backside of the house, and he would unlock the back door for me. I didn't even question it. I made my way to the back and couldn't believe how dark it still was. I figured he would turn on some kind of light, but nothing. I got to the back door and just stood there for a moment. I didn't know if he wanted me to walk inside, or if he was coming out to get me. I decided to call him again on what he said was his work phone. Instead of hearing the ring in my ear, I heard a generic ringtone coming from behind me, not from inside the house. but from the bushes in the backyard. I hate to even say this, but this was the first time I finally felt that something wasn't right. Keith ran out from the bushes, waving his ringing flip phone. With that same strange voice, he told me he had been getting rid of some old food and was just coming out to greet me. He said he didn't mean to alarm me. He claimed he liked to feed the squirrels and whatever other animals lived in those bushes. I told him it was fine and that I just wanted to see the couch so I could be on my way. In a cheerful voice, he said, "Of course." He skipped past me, almost stumbling as he passed. We got to the back door, and it looked like he was struggling to open it. When he told me to meet him in the back, I had assumed he would be opening it from inside the house, not trying to open it from the outside. This was the first time I got a good look at Keith. At least, as good a look as I could get in the limited light. He was older, but not old. Maybe late 50s. He was really skinny and had long white hair pulled back into a dirty ponytail. Worst of all, he smelled like a filthy ashtray. He pulled away from the door and asked if I could help him get it open. He said sometimes it would stick, and he was embarrassed that he couldn't get it open. He told me to just use my shoulder and push as hard as I could. At this point, I knew something was wrong, but I was already in the moment, just going along with it. I grabbed the doorknob and lowered my shoulder into the door. It didn't stick at all. In fact, the moment I pushed, someone from the other side opened the door. I had so much momentum that I lost my balance and fell straight to the floor. The second I hit the ground, I heard Keith yell, "Now!" In the darkness, two other people emerged and pinned me down. I started struggling, but it didn't matter. One of the guys was huge. Keith started kicking me in the face. One of the worst parts was the darkness. I couldn't see anything. That made everything feel 10 times worse. I could feel my body starting to weaken from the hits. Then Keith told the other guy to grab the tape. I heard the sound of tape ripping. I couldn't even imagine what they were planning to do. What happened next is probably the closest thing to a miracle that has ever happened to me. During the struggle, when I fell and was being held down, I had accidentally dialed my friend, the same friend I had been staying with. I could hear him yelling hello through the phone, loud and clear. That's when I yelled, "I'm in the back of the house. Come help me." It was a complete bluff. I was alone, but I needed them to believe I wasn't. The big guy loosened his grip and looked at Keith. Keith paused. That 1 second, that was all I needed. I broke free. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted to my car, jumped in, locked the doors, and started it. I could hear them chasing me, but I didn't turn around. As I sped off, I saw the big guy clearly for the first time. Bald, patchy beard, but his eyes looked completely lifeless. He was trying to open my car door even as I was driving away. I just kept going. I drove for hours before going back to my friend's place. I was terrified they might follow me. I didn't want them to know where I was staying. I called my friend back and told him everything. Eventually, I contacted the police, but it was too late. The post was gone. The phone was a disposable. Keith had disappeared. I gave them descriptions, but as far as I know, those 3 men are still out there. What scares me the most isn't what happened. It's what almost happened. This wasn't just a robbery. That $45 couch was bait. Whatever they wanted. It wasn't just money. And sometimes I still think about that night and how close I came to never making it out.